Welcome everyone, my name is Brayton and today we're going to be jumping into Unreal 4 to do some basic material creation. We're going to be actually creating from scratch a pretty basic material and exposing some parameters that are pretty typical of a master material, including things like tinting for your color channel, being able to control the UV tiling amount, being able to control your normal intensity, and being able to adjust your roughness and metal, as well as some other things. So I'll actually have timestamps on the video right in front of you here of where you can jump around if you want to go to a specific channel. And I also will have the video itself on YouTube segmented into different chapters if you want to jump around and find them there. But other than that, I think we're ready. We're going to go ahead and jump into Unreal 4 and get started. Okay, so here we are in Unreal 4 now, and this is actually going to be Unreal 4.26, just as a reference for those of you maybe coming from the future versions. Just as a reference, some things might look a little bit different as things have gone on. But yeah, so we're working in 4.26 here, and the very first thing we're actually going to do is we're going to bring in our textures to work with. In my case, I have some textures here that I've created in Substance Designer, and I'm actually working with a packed map system. So instead of having, for example, 3 2K textures for Roughness, Metalness, and Ambient Occlusion, I have one packed texture that is still a 2K texture, but it has all 3 of those in the RG and B channels, and actually I even have a 4th cavity mask that I was using in the alpha channel. We can cover doing packed mapping in another tutorial at some point later, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other places you can look up how to do that if that is something you're interested in. But for this case, I just want to make sure that we have it all set up correctly, and just something to consider if you are going down this route here. I'm going to pop open my texture real quick and bring it over, so you can see here's the cavity thing. But so just for reference here, here's my AO. Why does it keep doing that? Here's my roughness, and there's my metalness, which in this case is just a fully black material because it's a fully dielectric material. And then what you actually want to double check here is just make sure that your sRGB is unchecked for your packed maps, because I can show you an example actually. If I turn on the roughness view here, if you left it on, you can see that the texture gets a lot brighter, which is going to result in a much rougher material than you were expecting. So it changes your values just because it's a color thing, and it ends up changing the dynamic range of colors or something like that. And so you just want to double check that that is unchecked, otherwise you will not be getting the results you're expecting. Make sure your compression settings are set to default, and that should be all you have to change. Go ahead and hit save there. And then yeah, the first thing we're going to actually do is we're going to right click in here, create our material, and you can name this whatever you want. I'm going to go ahead and name it material _ tut follow along. Gonna pop that open, and then we'll drag our textures into there. Now before we get to do any parameter stuff, let's go ahead and just set up our textures, getting them plugged into the correct channels and making sure that everything's nice and tidy. I'm going to try and do a lot of housekeeping as I go, because this makes, 1, easier for you guys to follow along with what I'm doing, and 2, for myself, if I was ever to return to this material, I need to know what the hell I did at the time, and so it definitely helps to keep things like straightforward and clean as you go along. So I'm going to go ahead and I plugged my base color into the base color output, my normal into the normal output, and then in this case, because I have that texture that's a packed map, you want to make sure that your sampler type is set to linear color if you're doing packed maps, because you turned off that sRGB, so it's going to be linear color instead of regular color. I'm going to plug, in this case, my roughness is my ambient occlusion, my green channel is my roughness, and my blue channel is my metalness. But the very first parameter we're actually gonna tackle is the ability to switch out which textures are being referenced for your different maps. So we're gonna select all of these individually, convert to parameter, and you can just name it base color. I'll name this one Orm for occlusion, roughness, metalness, and then I'll name this guy normal. And here, just to show you, for those of you who aren't actually familiar with how master materials and material instances work, the reason that you do this, you create a material that has these exposed parameters. The reason you do that is because then you're using a lot less draw calls, and because all your materials will then be referencing the same master material, it's going to cut down on performance costs of using these materials, and it also allows you to make material instances. For example, if I right click this and go create material instance, and just do material instance test. If you open this guy up, you can see that here's our 3 parameters that we've so far opened up, and the only thing that you can do is you can change the texture that they're using. for those guys there. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and dive into start creating parameters per each channel. Although before we actually get to that, we're going to go ahead and do a UV scale parameter, which is really useful for getting some extra tiling out of your material if you are using tiling textures. That will allow you to up the scale, or up the UV scale, and you also, we're going to set up a parameter so that you can control the horizontal and the vertical ratio separately. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and right click and type text. Got my caps lock on there. Text chord. And then we're going to bring in a multiply node. Plug that in there. And then we're going to hold down 1 and click twice. And that'll create 2 vector1 scalar parameters. We're going to actually right click on each of these individually. I'm going to name this one U scale. And this one is going to be V scale. And together these will make up the ratio. So imagine if these are set to default of 1, that the ratio of 1 to 1 would be typically what you see. That's what these all textures are currently set to, right? So we're going to go ahead and get an append node, which will take those 2 individual vectors and combine them into a vector 2 instead of 2 vector 1s. So now they reference a UV. They actually create a UV coordinate, and then we can plug that into the B of our multiply. Now this is great. This will get us the ratio, and hypothetically you could leave it here, but for the ease of use, it's not very efficient. Say if you set your if you set your ratio of what you liked U to V to be, and then you wanted to also increase the tiling, it'd be really obnoxious if you had to individually go and find something that was like 10 to 15, or I don't know. It'd be a lot more finagly to be messing with it that way. I'll propose a much simpler way of doing things is once you can consider this to be your coordinates for your ratio of your textures, and then we're actually going to grab another multiply, plug that in there, grab another vector 1, and then we're going to convert this to a parameter. I'm going to call this one UV tiling amount and set it to a default value of 1. And then we'll go ahead and plug this multiply into each of the UV sections of our textures. And then just before I show you here in the material instance, I'm just going to go ahead and do some housekeeping. We'll hit save. And then if we jump over to our material instance, you'll now see we have 3 new parameters available to us. And so if I was to open up the U and the V parameters, you can see, for example, if I change the V scale to 2, it's going to stretch it vertically more and more the higher we go with this. We set that back to 1, and then it'll do the same thing in the horizontal direction for the U scale. And then this one will do both at the same time. So it'll keep the ratio consistent of a 1 to 1, or if we wanted to do 0.5 to 1, it will keep that ratio, where you can see now it is wider than it is tall. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to doing the individual channels. Starting with base color, I guess we'll just go ahead and start at the top here. I'm going to go ahead and drag these out of the way just for now so we have a little bit of wiggle room to play with. And what we're going to do with our base color channels, we're actually going to be giving a parameter to create tint, and you'll be able to control the color and also the intensity of that color on top of your base color texture. So we're going to go ahead and start by bringing in a vector 3 color node, which I did by holding down 3 and clicking. And I don't know, we'll set this to just as something visible. We'll set it to a default color of red. And then I'm going to go ahead and multiply by that color. And that will then be our tint. So if we were to preview this node specifically, you can see that this is going to look like our base color information, but it's got that red value over the top of it, or that red hue over the top of it. So that creates our color node. That's super easy, right? Now to be able to control the actual intensity, we're going to go ahead and bring in something new. We're going to bring in a lerp node, which will basically create a... It's not working. There it is. Hold down L and click. I don't know why that wasn't working, but eventually it did. What a lerp does is it goes between A and B based on whatever your alpha set is. So in this case, we're going to use it. We're going to have tint intensity. We want to go ahead and hold down S and create a new parameter And so the difference between, by the way, 1 and S, 1 just creates a vector, and S creates a vector that's already converted to a parameter instead of having to right-click and click on Convert to Parameter. But we're going to go ahead and name this guy Tint Intensity and plug that into our alpha. I'm going to set this to, actually I'm going to keep it at a default value of 0. No, we'll keep it at a value of 1, sorry. Because we're going to keep this default value at pure white, which basically will mean that there's no tinting anyway, because any texture multiplied by 1 is just going to be itself. So it'll basically be like it's already untouched, essentially. And then what we're going to do is I'm also going to make sure that we cap this at 0 and 1, because there's no reason to go above that. With this, it won't actually do anything. We're going to have our tinted effect is going to be B. So you'll see 100% of our tint when this is at 1 because it's plugged into the B channel. And then we're going to take our original base color texture and we're going to plug that into the A of the lerp, so that when our intensity is at 0, it'll just be the base color without any issues, without any tint on it. And then we're going to go ahead and take that lerp, and now we're going to plug that into the base color instead of our traditional, or our original base color texture. So now before we jump over to the material instance to see how that worked out, we also need to remember to convert this guy to a parameter. And I'm just going to name it tint color. And we'll go ahead and save, and we'll jump over to the material instance. Okay, so here we are in the parameters for the material instance now again. We can go ahead and change our tint color to whatever we would like. I guess I'll just use something like a blue in here. Or actually, we'll go to a different color just because it's already kind of starts as a blue. And you can see now that it's now converted that to kind of a green overlay. And then we can control our intensity here. So like I said before, 1 is going to be purely the result of that multiplied by that base color texture, and then tint intensity of 0 is obviously going to neutralize the tint, and there's no tint at all. So one more thing I'm actually going to show you guys, just for a little bit further housekeeping, right? You can see it's kind of strange that like tint intensity is up here and the color's down here, and it gets mixed in with like some of the UV scaling parameters. We want to make sure that we keep things clean so that they're easy to find and change, and everything's next to each other. So I'm actually going to go ahead and go through all the different parameter sections here, and I'm going to apply a group. So I'm just going to call this one UV scaling. And once you've typed it, you can just go ahead and go to the drop down. It should be there. So we've created a UV group. I'm going to name this one. Actually, we're going to do this. We're going to do a group for base color, and we'll include the tint in that base color group, since that is the channel that is affecting. And then we go ahead and save again, and we'll jump over to the parameters. Okay, so now that we've done that cleanup, you can see here that we actually have this group for the base color. So it has the ability to change the texture as well as the color and intensity. And then we'll do the same as we're going forward with our normal and our roughness, metalness, and all that stuff. So the last thing I'll actually say on the topic of housekeeping here with our parameters is if you look at the UV scaling thing, it's a little bit strange that the order of our parameters looks like this, where you have your U scale and then you have the UV tiling amount and then the V scale, for example. And that might not be desirable. In this case, that's definitely not what I would like. And I wish that there was an easier way to reorder your parameters in this list, but the only way that I know of is going to actually be to change what's called the sort priority. So I'm going to go ahead and let me move my camera here because I know I've been covering up this details panel here. But if you jump here, you'll see that there's a sort priority button, or inbox input. And so if we jump over to our U scale, V scale, and UV tiling amount, they're all set to 32. Every parameter you create is by default set to a value of 32. And it's going to go in order numerically. So if you set something to 1 and then something to 2, 1 will always be put above 2 in that list. So because these are all sharing the same group, if we go ahead and set U scale to 1, V scale to 2, and then UV tiling amount to 3, and go ahead and save. When you jump back over to your parameter list here, you'll see now that it's in the correct order of UV tiling amount. Now, of course, this doesn't actually have any impact on the functionality of the material, but of course it makes it much easier to understand the flow of the parameters and what actually things are doing. It's a much nicer thing to look at than having your parameters all over the place and out of a weird order. Yes, it takes a little bit longer, and I wish that there was some more easy to use tools for doing stuff like this in Unreal. But that's just how it is. And if you are willing to spend that time to do it, I think it's well worth it. So, okay, so we're gonna go ahead and jump back into doing some parameter stuff with our material here. And you can see that I did move the camera over and did a little flip job just because I know that I was covering up the detail panel here, which is important stuff for you guys to see. So obviously I wanted to make sure I uncovered that. And I'll go ahead and fix in post some stuff if there was some stuff that you might have missed from me covering it up prior. So we're going to go ahead and move on though, and we're going to jump into doing some stuff with our occlusion, roughness, and metalness map here, and I'll plug that in there. And we'll go ahead and start with the ambient occlusion here just because it's in the red channel and it's at the top. There's actually not much to do with the ambient occlusion for this basic material. We're just going to basically give the ability to control the intensity of that ambient occlusion in your map. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and create a lerp, which again is going to, if you hold down L and click, it'll create a lerp node. And what we're going to want is that full ambient occlusion intensity. We're going to want our map, right? So that would be B. And for 0 intensity, we're just going to want it to be pure white because that's what a empty ambient occlusion map would look like. So actually, if we change our constant A, if you just go ahead and click on the lerp, you can change these values here instead of having to plug in a value or anything like that. And we're going to just take that A and we're going to set it to 1 so that when alpha is 0, it will be fully white, meaning there's no ambient occlusion. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create our scalar parameter. I'm going to call that AO intensity. Plug that in there. And then we'll plug that guy into our ambient occlusion output. I'm going to set this to a value of 1 so that by default it is at full power. So that's great. That was actually all we had to do for the ambient occlusion channel. So then we'll move on to the roughness. And the very first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to introduce a contrast node. So there in Unreal by default is a cheap contrast is what it's called. And you plug in a channel. There's one that's individually one for grayscale, and then there's also a color contrast that's for color nodes. So obviously in this case we're not going to be using the colored one, but we're going to create a parameter. I'm going to call this roughness contrast and plug that into here, and again set it to a default of 1, which I think is, when set at 1, it's as if nothing's happening. There's no contrast change. But if you go above 1, it'll start having a crunchier contrast. And if you go, it'll start increasing that contrast. And if you go below 1, it'll start decreasing that contrast all the way down to 0, where you're essentially going to be flattening your entire map to 1 color or 1 value. So we'll plug that guy into the roughness here. And then the next thing we're going to do after that is we're going to want to introduce the ability to do some minor adjusting to the channel. So, for example, changing your contrast might push some values in and out of range of what you're looking for. So then to be able to do some extra tweaking without having to go back and open up Substance Painter or wherever you created your textures, Substance Designer, whatever it is, without having to tweak the textures there, you can actually just do some minor stuff in Engine still. We're going to go ahead and create a roughness adjustment parameter. And to do that, we're going to hold down A and click, and that's going to create an add node, which is a new one we haven't dealt with yet today. But it does exactly what you'd expect it to. We're going to plug in that cheap contrast output into B or A. It doesn't really matter, but that's what I'm doing. And then I'm going to hold down, again, we're going to create a vector 1 and plug that into our A. I'm going to promote this to a parameter and call it roughness adjust. And then set it to, keep it at a default of 0. And then what I'm going to do is set a minimum of -1 and then a maximum of +1. And the reason we're going to allow it to go into the negative is because, just like you'd expect, if you add a negative number, it's going to act like a subtraction, essentially. And so if you wanted to make your roughness a little bit shinier, less rough, then you'd be able to do that by going down to -1 and then adding to it to make it more rough. And then we'll go ahead and replace that. Now that that is a new chain link, we're going to replace the contrast and now plug that into the roughness. Now, this actually introduces a potential issue. For PBR compliancy, you want to make sure that your values for roughness stay within the 0 to 1 range. And so it's very possible, for example, if you had like a 0.2% percent, or sorry, a 0.2 value for your roughness before doing anything with the contrast and the roughness adjustments, that if you're then to subtract anything more than 0.2, you're going to push it below 0, which is going to push it out of PBR compliance. And so to actually fix that, we're going to just add a quick clamp node and make sure that this is set to a default of 0 and 1 for the min and max. And we'll plug that into here and then plug that into our roughness. And so that'll just make sure that no matter what is coming out of the add, if it's above 1 or below 0, it's going to bring those values back in. So your maximum values will become 1 and your lowest values will become 0. Now, to do something a little bit more complicated, and also what creates a little bit more versatility for this is imagining you can use this master material for instances where you have a roughness texture, or you just want to set a default uniform roughness value for the entirety of the material. What we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to create a switch that will switch between using a texture and using a value. And what's nice about this is it's actually going to be really cool how it cleans up your parameter list when, for example, you set that switch to just a uniform value. You won't have your parameters for roughness, contrast, and roughness adjustments because they'll be irrelevant for that specific parameter when you're using a uniform value. So that might sound a little bit confusing, but we'll go ahead and get into it as we're creating it here. I think it'll make more sense. What you're going to do is you're going to type switch, and there's specifically a static switch parameter. And that's the one we want there. I'm going to call this use roughness texture, and when set to true, we're going to want to do all of that stuff we've just been doing with our clamp and adjusting and contrast. We'll go ahead and plug this into our roughness. And when it's set to false, we actually just want to include a value. So I'm going to go ahead and hit S to create that parameter. And I'm just going to call this uniform value, roughness uniform value. And we'll plug that into the false. So when that static switch is set to false, don't use a texture. You'll then have the ability to create or to use a value specifically to drive the entirety. And make sure that this by default is set to true. So we'll go ahead and check that. So now if we jump back into our parameters once again, you'll see that we have this ORM group here. We have the ability to change our reference texture. Here's our AO intensity parameter that we created. And then we have all of our roughness things here together with that check mark at the top. So here you can see that when use roughness texture is set to true, we have the ability to change the contrast and the adjustment of the roughness. And if we set it to false, those parameters go away and our uniform value parameter comes in, and we can change this on the fly so that now the entire roughness of the entire parameter or of the entire material is just that one uniform value that we're setting right there. So jumping back into the material here, we're actually going to do basically the same exact thing for the metalness channel. There's not any parameters that I can think of that for like a basic master material that would be necessary to have besides what we've already done here with our roughness, except for just specifically in the metalness channel. So we're going to go ahead and just repeat that process real quick. Just as a refresh, we'll go ahead and bring in that cheap contrast. I'm going to go ahead and grab my metalness channel and plug that in. I'm going to create a new parameter and call this metalness contrast. Set it to a default value of 1. And go ahead and plug it into our contrast amount value. Then I'm going to grab an add. Plug that into the B. I'm going to create a new parameter and call it metalness adjust. And I do recognize that in PBR, you're more or less supposed to keep your metalness values to either fully 1 or fully 0 and not really have too much in between in the middle. There's some stylistic stuff you can do if you want to mess with values in between those, but more or less you should try to keep to a binary mask of black or white, not much gray in the middle. But of course, rules are meant to be broken once you understand why they're in place, as at least my way of living. So all that to say, it might still be good for you if you would like to have that metalness adjustment here. But I do fully recognize that it might be a strange thing, and some people who know what I'm talking about might be rolling their eyes at me, but that's okay. So we got our metalness adjustment there. I'm going to create our clamp, just because in the same way that roughness, we don't want it to go below 0 or above 1. So that will solve that there. And then we're going to create a parameter, switch parameter. Just type in switch is easier. Static switch parameter here. And we'll put this into true. And we're going to name this use metalness texture. and then plug this guy into our Metalness output. We'll create one last parameter here for Metalness value. Plug that into our false. I'm going to go ahead and clamp it between 0 and 1, and I'm going to keep it at a default value of 0, so just that it's just a dielectric texture by default. So now you can see we have our roughness, our ambient occlusion, and our metalness parameters. So the next one we're going to go ahead and tackle here is actually going to be our normal channel, and this one's actually pretty fun because we're going to do some stuff that includes allowing you to control the normal intensity, whether you want to totally flatten the normal out or you want to increase it and make it better. And then we're actually going to deal with adding a detail normal. So this is something that you can sometimes see in materials where they'll add something that's like a tiling bumpiness or some kind of noise that they have a normal map for, that they want to add to whatever their material is or whatever their default base normal is. And so we're going to create the ability to blend those and then have an intensity of that detail normal and the scale of that detail normal separately. So we'll go ahead and do that here. The very first thing we're going to do is we're going to drop in a flatten normal. And we're going to plug our normalness into that here. And then we're going to take a scalar and call it normal intensity and plug that into our flatness. But if you think about it, right, so this flatten normal is actually, as your normal intensity value increases, you're actually going to be adding more flatness to it. So it's kind of weird and backwards thinking. So to make it a little bit more understandable, with a name like normal intensity, you would expect it to get stronger the higher that normal intensity value is, but currently it's operating opposite of that. So to fix that, we're actually going to introduce a 1 minus, which essentially just inverts it. We'll plug that into there and plug that there. And we'll set a default of 1 here. So now as normalness increases, so does the actual intensity of the normal map we're using. And so now to go ahead and move on to doing that detail normal that I was talking about, I'm going to go ahead and bring in a new texture that I haven't brought in quite yet. Let's see if I brought it into my shelf here. I have not. So I'm going to go ahead and look through my stuff here. And this is essentially just something I created in quickly in Designer, in Substance Designer, that was just a spots noise that was plugged into a normal map, and that was the result I have there. So it's a tiling texture that's basically just a little bit of a grittiness, like a bumpiness that I'm going to add to my surface here. We'll go ahead and bring that into, if I can find, we'll go ahead and bring that new normal into here just so we have it. And we need to do some of that preliminary stuff of converting it to a parameter, calling it detail normal in this case. We're going to go ahead and actually just copy this. And plug that into the UVs. But that also means we're going to need to change detail. And I'm going to go ahead and just basically change the parameter names on these guys here before we move forward. Okay, so now we have a separate UV control for our detail normal, separate from our normal channel, the base normal control from the UV scale that we created earlier. So that's good. Now to start combining these guys, we're actually going to use something called a blend angle corrected normals here. And this is as simple as being able to plug in a base normal and then an additional normal. And then on the back end, essentially what this is doing is, to be able to combine two normals, you have to essentially cut the blue out of one of them, because if you start trying to overlay a blue on top of another normal, it's just going to essentially flatten that. It's going to make a weird effect. So you don't really need to know how it works. You can look into it if you want to, but that's essentially what this is doing under the hood for us. Is really nice. And you know what? Now thinking about it, we might actually want to flatten normal for our detail normal specifically. Actually, you know what? We're going to do it differently. We're going to do it this way. So this is going to combine our two maps here, and actually I can preview this real quick. I don't know how easily you'll be able to see it, but you can see all these little pimpling on top of the surface here. If I compare that to just, if I was to reference this guy, you can see now that it has effectively combined our two things, our two different normal maps here, which is great. To now add like a normal detail normal intensity, you could either just control the flatten normal and do it here which is great. You could do it that way, it works totally fine. But just to show you a different way to do things, we're essentially going to do exactly what we did beforehand up here with the lerp, where we're going to go ahead and lerp between this new detail normal map and just the effect without the normal map, without the detail normal map. And then we'll create a new parameter for detail normal intensity. Set it to a value of 0 is fine. And we'll plug that into our alpha there. And then we'll be able to plug that into our normal. So now back in the parameter list once again, you can see that we now have our new normal folder here, panel, where we have the ability to change our texture. Now we can change our normal intensity, so it's at a default of 1. We can change that to 2, and you can see that that increases. Or if we like really blast it, you get some interesting results there. And then we have our detail normal, so again, it's a separate texture now that it can reference. And you can actually see the results here. If I change this up to 1, you can see that it started adding something on top there. We're going to change our tiling to something like 8, maybe in 16. And then you can see here that now we have this normal thing here. And actually I was thinking here, we're going to go back into here, and we are going to do it the way I was originally thinking, where we're going to add a flattened normal. And the reason for that is, essentially, this, doing it the way that we did originally set it up, where we're controlling this detail normal intensity through the lerp here, means that you're officially tied to the maximum normal you can increase it to is the default texture here, which might be fine. But in the case here, you saw how I could do with our normal intensity here. I can go to like 5,000. And yes, you get some weird results, but even going to like 5 or something, for example, might give you results you're looking for, which is nice. But we can't do that with our detail normal intensity currently the way it's set up. So we're going to go ahead and actually retcon that and change it to do it like we did originally. We're just going to go ahead and drop in a flattened normal again. Plug in here. Plug that into our additional normal. And then instead of plugging that into the alpha of our lerp, we're going to go ahead and plug that into a 1 minus again. We're going to plug that into our flatness there. And then we'll plug this into our normal instead. And totally just ignore the lerp. And now you can see when we jump back into here, if I go ahead and set this original normal intensity back to something reasonable like 1, and then as we adjust our metalness here, the intensity of the metalness now, we can do those exorbitant crazy values because of the way we've restructured our graph. Again, yes, you can get some undesirable weird effects, but it opens up the parameters to do some more things and just give a little bit more versatility to your material here. And then the last thing here I'll actually show you, which is kind of cool, is the way that we've built this, you can even actually invert your normal. So instead of having it go bumpy outwards, you can set this to a negative value, and it'll start eating into the normal here. And that's actually true of the default normal as well. So if your normal map needs to be inverted, I could set this to 1, for example, and now it looks like the panel lines are pushing out and the panels themselves are pushing in, which again, in this case is kind of silly, but it's nice to know that you can do that if you are looking to. And now the last thing I'll actually show you here, I was kind of considering whether I did or did not show this, but this is pretty simple, so I figured we might as well use it, is we can actually use the emissive channel, and I'll create one more parameter for that guy, or actually 2 more parameters. We're going to create our emissive color, which I'll set to, I don't know, a red. Red's always a good test color because it's bright and obvious. Boop. And then we're going to make a multiply, a scalar value. We're going to go emissive intensity. And this would be for the simplest version of a emissive, right? In some cases, you would have a mask that you would multiply it by if you only wanted that emissive to apply to a certain area. So we could set up that ability to use or not use. We could do our trick with the switch and say use emissive mask. Grab a texture sample here. I don't have a mask on hand, so I won't be able to actually show one that's handy, but we can convert this to a parameter called emissive mask and say true. And then false, we can just plug in this where it's just using the emissive color and the emissive intensity. And actually, sorry, the way we want to do this is we want to multiply this by our mask and plug that into true, so that the use emissive mask true is going to be multiplied by our mask. So wherever it's white, it will still work, and wherever it's black, it'll be neutralized. And if it's set to false, it'll just use the emissive color and the emissive density universally across the material. And we'll plug that into emissive color. And that is actually all we have for emissive. It's actually pretty simple there. And just looking through the list there, that's more or less what will cover the gambit of your like parameters for a pretty basic master material. So actually, I'll go ahead and show you. We'll create 2 or 3 material instances with this, and we'll set them to some different things, and you can just see how on the fly we can create something that's pretty different. Just using this one master material that once we've set it up is actually very easy to change things. So I've brought in some resources now that have allowed me to take our material that we've just created, our base master material, and add some different things to it in its material instances, and we've got a few different effects now. So I go ahead and open these up. Actually, so this one looks pretty cool. We'll go ahead and start here though. This is basically with everything untouched. This is just the default of everything we've set up today. This is just wanted to kind of show off, like, obviously these are my textures, so you won't have these on hand to make it look exactly like I have, but you should see that you have the place to replace the textures if you want to, for normal, for detail normal, for color, for roughness, and for your ORM rather, if you have your packed map. And you have the ability to change the tint, and you have the ability to change your normal intensity. You have the ability to change roughness and metalness and emissive power and AO and all that stuff there if you followed everything today, which is awesome. And some of the stuff you can get through that is, what I did is I brought in here the ambient occlusion map that I had for this material. I actually inverted it so that it was just white where the like panel lines were, and I use that as my emissive mask so I could control the color of this emissive in the line, so it kind of looks like this weird sci-fi futuristic Tron cyberpunky looking thing, which is pretty fun. And you can see I can change the emissive to a bunch of different things if I want to. So that one's cool. I brought in another material here, which is just this heat shielding material that I made for a game called Grimstar that I'm working on. You can see that I actually made the base color a neutral color when I was making it, so it's just a pure white. And the reason that's good is because then when you do a tint color, I can make it any color I want to without any underlying color influencing that final result color. Like with the original material that we did, regardless of what you change your tint color to, it's always going to have a tinge of that underlying blue that we started with. It's always going to be influenced by that, rather. And so if you plan to make your base color neutral ahead of time, or you use a color mask to mask out a certain part that you want to, that'd be something you have to build into the material. That's not something we did today with our master material. But there's ways you can take anything that you learned in today and you can apply it to what you're specifically dealing with, which is cool. Hopefully you learned a lot about like the process and like more of the math behind it and the why of the thing, rather than just like following word for word what I did and only being able to do what I've accomplished here today. Hopefully you can take that knowledge and expand it to your specific needs. That's the end of that first tutorial. We're probably planning to do some more of these materials that are going to be a little bit more in depth and do some things that are a little bit more than just basics that we did today. If you have any suggestions for things you'd like to see in regards to UE4 materials, or anything else actually related to UE4, definitely feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll be checking that to see. Did want to drop real quick that I have recently created a Patreon, so if you did feel like supporting me, obviously I would very much appreciate that. And I'll list some of the benefits on screen here. I'll be doing a little scroll by of some of the stuff that's up there, and as well as leaving the link for it in the description. I really hope everything we covered today was pretty clear and concise for you. But if you do have any questions, again, feel free to ask those in the comments, and I'll be happy to help you and do any clarification that needs to happen. And other than that, really appreciate you stopping by and hanging with me for this last 40 minutes or whatever it was. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Thank you.